Good evening. So good to see you all tonight. I'm Mary Pat Higgins. I'm the president and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. It's fun to have a moderator who can give me some grief. Thank you for being here for our Civil Discourse Series program, Reimagining Immigration Toward a Just and Functional System. I'd like to start by extending a very special thank you to our presenting sponsor for this series, the Meadows Foundation. Thank you so much for making the Civil Discourse Series possible. We're very grateful. And we have additional support provided by Celia and Larry Schoenbrunn, a lifetime director of the museum. We're very grateful for their support as well. I'd also like to thank our community partners, Southwest Jewish Congress and the Vickery Meadow Youth Development Foundation. We always appreciate having community partners helping us get the word out about our event, so thank you very much. We appreciate it. And as usual, I'd like to thank our board members who are in the audience, our museum members, our generations members, and volunteers. We couldn't do our work without your critical support. You make what we do possible, so thank you very much. If you are not engaged with the museum and would like to learn how to get engaged, please go to our website, dhhrm.org, and look at becoming a member or a volunteer. Contact one of us if you're not sure how to get involved. We'd love to have you become more engaged. The goal of our Civil Discourse Series is to present multiple sides of a thought-provoking topic through respectful discussion, something that is far too rare in our polarized world. We see our role in the community not only as an educator, but as a convener, serving as a place where we can gather to learn from one another. Tonight, we will discuss U.S. immigration, a topic that I know is top of mind for many of us, and about which many of us have strong opinions. However, I would like to ask you to please refrain from clapping, booing, or whispering to each other during the program. It is not in the spirit of tonight's theme of civil discourse. We'll have time for questions at the end of the program. Please write your questions on the note cards, and our staff will come around and collect them. If you are joining us via Zoom, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and enter your questions. And I know Bill will get to as many of them as possible. I'd also like to ask that you silence your cell phones and electronic devices so we can enjoy the program without disruption. It's now my great pleasure to introduce my friend, our moderator for tonight, Bill Holston. Bill has provided pro bono legal services to immigrants for over 30 years, ultimately representing individuals from 21 countries. He currently serves as CEO of the Dallas Eviction Advocacy Center, which offers legal advice and representation, housing support, and rent assistance. From 2012 to 2023, Holston was the executive director of the Human Rights Initiative of North Texas, representing immigrant survivors of human rights violations. The recipient of several local and statewide awards, Holston holds a JD from SMU Dedman School of Law and is a longtime member and friend of the museum. Bill, thanks so much for moderating tonight. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Mary Pat. It's a real pleasure to be here, especially with this fantastic panel. You're really all privileged to hear from tonight, and I'd like to do a brief introduction for all of them. I encourage you to read their full bios in the program, so I'm just going to say a top line and then an observation about each of them. Laura Collins is the director of the Bush Institute SMU Economic Growth Initiative. I met her on a panel, one of these civic discourse panels here at SMU, and she was instrumental in having great community partnerships with Human Rights Initiative and lots of other organizations in the city. And also, you're particularly skilled at speaking about immigration to across different political divides, and I really admire that about you.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Jim Hollifield is the I had to read this, I couldn't remember. Ora Nixon Arnold, Professor of International Political Economy at SMU's Department of Political Science. He serves as the director of the Tower Center and the acting director of the Texas-Mexico Center. I first came across your work in doing public speaking about immigration, and I looked for materials that were thoughtful, intelligent, and had a scholarly approach to immigration, and I used your papers often when I spoke about immigration. I really appreciate that.
Thanks, Bill.
You bet. Paul Hunker is a partner at the law firm of DeMott, McKesney, Cartwright, and Armendariz, where he provides immigration services, legal services. He's also an adjunct professor at SMU Dedman School of Law. He will, from 2003 to January 2024, he served as chief counsel of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. I loved your bio, said that before that you worked for the INS, which goes back a few years. I met Paul as opposing counsel in an asylum case. We tried more than one asylum case against each other, and he was really what you hope is a zealous advocate for the government and someone who was interested in pursuing justice. And then while you were at the OPLA, the
ICE lawyers.
I'm sorry?
The ICE lawyers.
Yeah, the ICE lawyers. You were accessible and built great bridges to nonprofit communities and law firms, and I'm really proud that we moved from being opposing counsel in lawsuits to friends. So
it's been a pleasure, Bill.
Great. Well, let's get right into it. We've got a lot to cover, and so I'm going to get right into the questions. And our very first question is for you, James. The United States began regulating immigration and naturalization soon after independence. How would you characterize early immigration policy in the United States, and how did it compare to that of other countries at the time?
Okay, well, I think everyone in the room has heard the expression that we are a nation of immigrants, a nation of nations. So if I had a chance, I'd put a quote on the screen from our first president, George Washington, who said, you know, America is a nation that is open to the downtrodden, the persecuted of the world. We welcome into the bosom of our country, our nation. So from the beginning, the United States was seen as a place of refuge, a land of refuge. Of course, everyone in here knows that George Washington also had a couple hundred slaves. So I once had a student who told me in class, she said, Professor Hollifield, I understand why the Germans, the Irish came here, and the Italians came here, but she said, why did the Africans immigrate to the United States? So you know, I've had to teach this throughout my career. But if you look at the early regulation of immigration, I've got a former student of mine, Professor Anna Law at Brooklyn College. I would encourage you to go on her website and look. She's been writing a lot about how we did this in the 19th century. And most of you probably do not know that immigration, to the extent it was controlled first by the colonies and by the individual states. So there was no federal immigration policy. Yes, we had some laws governing immigration, naturalization from the beginning, but the system was basically run through the states. If you had to ask me, you know, when did we first develop a federal immigration policy? I don't know if this was a class, I'd stop and ask questions, but we can't do that. It was in 1882, which is relatively late in the game, if you think about it, when the federal government began to exercise control over immigration. What happened in 1882? It was the Chinese Exclusion Act, where we started the process of stopping Asians from coming to the U.S., and it was the newish state of California that lobbied for that law and that provision. I often ask my students, you know, where is citizenship defined? How do we know who is a citizen? Of course, now we're having a big debate about that again, but we didn't have a clear definition of citizenship until the 14th Amendment, you know, which was adopted after the Civil War. So it was relatively late when the U.S. began to develop immigration citizenship policies. These would evolve very rapidly in the late 19th and early 20th century as we get into the the third great wave of immigration, which really started in the 1880s and would crest in the period of World War I and then in the 1920s. So my point here is we didn't regulate immigration. And if you think about something as simple as a passport, you know, when did we start having passports? The passport was invented in the early 20th century. Around the time of World War I, when states said, okay, we need to know who are our citizens, who are not our citizens, because we got to draft people, we're going into a war. So the passport itself was a relatively late invention. So probably all of you, most of you in this room have seen the opening scenes of, I guess it's Godfather 2, where the young Vito Corleone arrived. I mean, that's how immigrants came here. They got on boats, they came here, they were screened to see if they had any diseases, if they were undesirables. But, you know, that's how they arrived, like the young Vito Corleone on that ship. You can see the ship entering New York Harbor, passing the Statue of Liberty. So it took a long time for us to really develop federal immigration laws and policies. When we really began to stiffen them was in the 1920s.
So you've alluded to some of this, but to what extent have foreign policy and national security concerns driven immigration policy?
Always. That's been true from the beginning. We were very fearful of foreigners coming into this country. There's always been a fear of a subversive or a criminal element coming in. Or that the immigrants would never assimilate. Most of you have heard of Benjamin Franklin, one of our founding fathers, he said, you can't allow the Germans in here. They're swarthy, dark-skinned, dangerous people. I don't know if anybody has any German heritage in here.
And they brought beer.
But the Germans there were too many of them. They were flooding into Pennsylvania, and Franklin said they'll never assimilate. But he changed his mind about the Germans because they became his voters, his constituents. You know, the things that were said about the Irish, I don't know, I bet nobody in here has any Irish background or Irish heritage, right? If you look at Texans and look at the number of people with Irish or German, you know, a lot of Texans fall into that category. But the Irish, I always tell the story of a young African-American guy who left his family farm in South Carolina and moved to New York City. He wrote a letter back home and he said, New York City is the most amazing place. You just wouldn't believe it. This was in 1900. It's very open. It's very free. And he said, guess what? I met the Irish and they're white, he said. So the Irish were not welcomed with open arms, and they were Roman Catholics. Very, very dangerous, subversive people who answered the Pope in Rome. Herbert Hoover, a very distinguished president of the United States, wrote a letter to a fellow Republican named Fiorello LaGuardia in 1930, I think it was. And he was angry about something with LaGuardia, but he wrote this letter and said, you Italians are all murderers and bootleggers. Dangerous people. You should go back. You and the other foreign spawn should go back where you belong. So we've always had this element of fear. You can think of the Red Scare. We had a Red Scare after the Russian Revolution, the 1920s, fear of communism. A lot of Central Eastern European Jewish immigrants were seen as very dangerous, that they had left-wing ideas. You know, so, and this would be repeated again in the 1950s during the McCarthy period. So each wave of immigration, Bill, you know, you see this kind of reaction, the fear that these people are dangerous, that they're bringing a criminal element with them, and that they're, you know, a real threat to the fabric of American society.
Great, thank you for that. So let's shift to today. Okay. Laura, I love this question. Can you talk about to what extent our immigration system is functional or dysfunctional, and give us some examples?
So I think that most of us can look at our immigration system today and understand the places where it's dysfunctional, right? We have a lot of backlogs on green cards, and I would say this is true of the last 10, 20 years. This is not just a today problem. So it takes a long time if you want to immigrate here legally. We have some temporary worker visa programs that some work better than others, but tend to be oversubscribed, tend to be more demand for those than the supply for those. So we don't really fill those gaps in our workforce as efficiently as we could. As we know, over the last 5 to 10 years, asylum has really become even more backlogged than it was before. It used to be you probably could get through, you know this from experience, you could get through an asylum case fairly quickly. Now you might not have a hearing for 6+ years. We know that the border right now looks pretty quiet, although numbers ticked up recently, but people still don't really have a way to come here that is not through, unless you qualify for a green card or a temporary worker visa, that's not something other than asylum. So you do still see people trying to utilize our asylum system, although they're not allowed to do that. And right now, enforcement seems to be the one place that is functioning. I don't know how well we want to say they're sticking to the rules. We know there's some due process concerns with the way we've seen people taken from immigration hearings, people who are trying to follow our rules. But overall, we have an immigration system that doesn't fit the needs of the country that we have. It doesn't fit the needs of the economy that we have. You know, we really believe at the Bush Institute that immigration policy needs to fit what the reality of the life that we have here is, and it needs to ensure the future prosperity, vitality, and security of our country. And so that means we need a lot of different reforms. This administration has chosen to pursue mass enforcement and full enforcement rather than working through a legislative process to try to overhaul other parts of our immigration system. That comes with trade-offs. I think we've all seen what those trade-offs look like. But we really believe that it's not just focusing on enforcement that matters to our immigration system. We also need to take a look at the legal immigration system. We need to take a look at humanitarian migration if there needs to be reforms there, and really make this a system that functions and that's efficient and that's beneficial to our country.
Paul, I noticed you reacted when Laura said something about how enforcement was functional at the moment. So do you want to expand, or do you want to respond to that or address it?
Well, functional is true. It's overly hyper-functional, and there's so much money arresting everyone, not distinguishing people that are threats from people that have been here a long time, and if the government would exercise some discretion, could get their green card. There's just there's no sense of prudence in terms of who the government is going after. I mean, they're certainly generally going after criminal non-citizens and bad actors, but if they apprehend anybody who's illegal, they will arrest them. I just had a consult today. A person came in 2016 from Pakistan, pending asylum. He's had his work authorization for 10 years. He's a truck driver. He did not seek immigration advice because he drives his truck to the border. And when you go to the border, you come back through checkpoints, and he thought he was fine. He's got this 10 years pending asylum. He's got his work authorization, but that doesn't give him legal status. And so when he came through the checkpoint, he was arrested. So there's really no judgment, and there's no humanitarian considerations that are going into ICE's mind at all in these current times.
Thank you for that. So let's talk about, when I think back at when you and I met and we talked about asylum, it was a topic Americans didn't think or talk about very much. So let's talk about that a little bit. Can you talk about to what extent is humanitarian relief for unaccompanied minors, asylum seekers, women fleeing violence? How is that functioning today in our immigration system?
Well, it's so part and parcel of our country post World War II, especially because of the horrors of World War II. There was this sense that countries need to welcome refugees, and that developed over time. They came in through parole, and then in 1980, the Refugee Act was passed. And if you feared persecution on account of your race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion, you have a well-founded fear of that, you could stay in the country. And that's a wonderful thing. I think it's important that I think those terms are interpreted properly. When they're interpreted too broadly, in my opinion, sort of just fleeing domestic violence, I don't think that really qualifies as one of the grounds. Bill may disagree, other people may disagree. But the greater you expand that, then the greater number of people who will come in and seek to apply for it. And the greater the number of people come in and apply for it, slow down the system. So people can come in, cross the border, get in line for asylum. It can take 5-10 years. They get work authorization. And it just sort of incentivizes more people to come. I think the same thing with unaccompanied juveniles. I mean, we all, President Bush in the last months of his presidency passed a bill that sort of protected unaccompanied juveniles, and that's great. I think we think of like the 10-year-old kid who's in the United States, and we want to sort of treat them with special humanitarian concern. But the way it's happened is, if you're under 18 years old and you're 17 years old and you're coming to this country to work, you're going to be basically let into the country, and so that would incentivize young people in Central America, who are reached, kind of it's time for them to work. They're 15, 16, 17 years old. They come to the United States. And then those numbers picked up in the tens. And then after Biden sort of relaxed some of the Trump limitations, there was this huge influx of unaccompanied juveniles. And you may remember we had to open up the Kay Bailey Hutchinson Convention Center for unaccompanied juveniles. And it was striking. When I was with ICE, you walk in there, and you just see like 2 football fields of black-haired Guatemalan boys. It's like intense to see it. And so when the policies are too generous, I think it leads to the reaction the other way. And I think that's a lot of, I think the law is on protection is pretty good. But when it's applied too liberally, I think it leads to reactions the other way. So it's like, I think you can think of our immigration enforcement as a pendulum, and perhaps you could say Obama went a little too far with DAPA, maybe giving 5 million people possible work authorization, and that, I think political scientists may say, that led to Donald Trump getting elected, who I think went too far the other way, and that led to Joe Biden getting elected, who I think a lot of his initial policies were, let's do the opposite of Donald Trump. And that in part led to the border crisis that we had and the numbers. And that again led to Donald Trump being elected and the sort of the super enforcement world we have now. So I think it's more of a matter of prudently applying the policies, and at least in terms of protection, that our laws are pretty good, but they just haven't been applied very well in a lot of ways.
I'd like to add, you said something really interesting about this, about when the Biden administration loosened back up protections for unaccompanied minors because they were trying to comply with the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. That's a good example of where maybe laws haven't caught up to reality. And that's what we talk about a lot on immigration policies. I do. You hear a lot in the political conversation, just enforce the law, just enforce the law. Laws always have discretion in enforcement. There's always policy. Sometimes the best policy doesn't align with what is legally required. And that's why we have to advocate for changes to the laws, right? That's why we need to update laws. That's why things need to meet the realities of today, and also look ahead at the future so that we don't have to be constrained as a country by laws that just aren't working in the way they were intended to.
Great, thanks for both of those answers. Paul, can we talk a little bit about the courts, about the immigration courts, where they fall in our legal system, how they function?
So the immigration courts are part of Department of Justice. In our immigration system, the Attorney General has a special authority over immigration. The law says his interpretations are sort of deferred to, although courts will reverse them if she is wrong. So the immigration judges are Department of Justice lawyers. So they're the executive branch, and the Department of Homeland Security brings cases before them, and then they adjudicate those cases. We've just seen, during 2025, we've just seen a string of decisions from what's called the Board of Immigration Appeals, so the appellate body of the immigration court, and their decisions can be binding, very anti-immigrant decisions. So it's making it much harder for non-citizens to get relief, to be released on bond. The administration just took a position, contrary to 30 years of law and practice, that if someone enters illegally, no matter how long ago it was in the past, they're not entitled to a bond hearing. And a lot of federal judges, including very conservative judges, are not agreeing with that. So the immigration court is very political. Stephen Miller has threatened, maybe not directly, but has sort of indirectly threatened the judges. A number of judges have been, I think over 100 judges have been fired from because they've got relatively higher rates of asylum grants. So judges are fearful. A bunch of military judges have been hired. I love the military. My dad was in the military. I love military judges, but they're getting a couple of weeks of training to decide life or death asylum cases.
Remember, who was the immigration judge once said the immigration courts are death penalty cases tried in traffic ticket courts. And does that ring true for you?
Yes, I mean, and now with some of the decisions, judges really aren't even giving people hearings. They're saying, I'm just going to look at your affidavits and I'll make a decision. You're not going to get a chance to even present your case because they're just trying to move and deport people so quickly. And they're detaining everyone. And it's much harder to put on your claim when you're detained.
One last enforcement question, Paul. Can you think of any justification for us sending people to a third country, such like the CCOT prison in El Salvador?
I was talking to one of my buddies at ICE, and who's a lawyer, and he was sort of like talking about the ethics of what's going on, and he was asking me what I thought was like just truly wrong. And the third country removals, I think, fall under that. When I was with ICE, if we had some really bad actor, a terrorist or something, maybe we'd agree. The United States would basically bribe some country to accept the person and let them be here. But now the Trump administration is using this, to remove. So, for example, Vietnam. They're accepting a few more people, but typically Vietnam would not accept many people, or Cuba would not accept many people. So the Trump administration has deals with other countries where that Cuban or that Vietnamese person could go to a third country. I think the absolute numbers are not that great in terms of the third country removals, and I think it's more shock and awe. They're scaring people. They want people to self-deport. I've heard different numbers, but I've heard as high as maybe you all know the numbers better than I do, but I've heard as high as like 2 million people have left since the Trump administration has started in January, and a fraction of that are actual deportations, which are up, but a larger number of people who are just leaving because of the fear, the third country removals, being sent to CCOT, the detention. The Trump administration is effectively scaring people to leave the country.
And those numbers ring true to you, 2 million?
Yeah, I think the number of foreigners living in the country's dropped by 2 million, over 2 million. So that is effectively people who are now leaving the country. So net migration has really gone down. And of those, I think it's about 1 million have left the workforce. So if you look at the numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you can see that employment has basically stopped. We're not employing people, and a lot of that is simply that we're pulling hundreds of thousands, 1 million people or more out of the labor market.
I feel like it's taking me longer for my waitress to get me my dinner. Like it just seems like in that sort of world that it's things are leaner and
well, if you go
tougher.
on the Dallas Fed website here, they've done a lot of surveys and looked at this, and the crunch is really there in different sectors of the Dallas economy. So we're just really beginning to feel the effects of this, where employment is shrinking. Certain sectors are retracting. And I saw a term the other day, which I like very much, called sneakflation. Inflation is creeping up, and when you don't have enough workers in a dynamic, high-growth economy, the economy is going to stop growing, and you will have prices going up.
Well, let's move from the cheery executive branch into the legislative branch. Laura, our hope is in Congress making changes. How is that working for us?
So I think first context, immigration policy is by and large set by Congress. That's where it should happen. That's where it's most effective because there's not a lot of authority granted to the other branches. But because for the last 10 plus years, not much has moved in Congress. I think the last time we really saw a big comprehensive bill get close was 2013. Before that, there was an effort in 2006, 2007, and those would have overhauled the entire immigration system. Those didn't pass Congress. There used to be DREAM Acts, bipartisan, that would, provide a path to citizenship for people brought here undocumented as children. Those don't really exist anymore. And so you've seen a lot of executive branch action on immigration policy. You see deferred action for childhood arrivals. You mentioned DAPA earlier. You've seen travel bans. You've seen border wall proclamations. You've seen lots of different things happen in the executive branch. And what happens when everything comes down from the executive branch are two things. One is that the next administration can come in and reverse them. Sometimes they do it very quickly. Sometimes they take a little longer to do that. As we saw in the Biden administration, they left some of the Trump administration policies at the tail end of the administration in place at the border, like Title 42. And then they get challenged in court, and there's a pause, and there's a ruling, and then it gets sent to the Supreme Court on an emergency docket. And that's not how we want policy made. Immigration policy is really big and important. There's a lot of details. And you really do want it to be made on a bipartisan way and in Congress because our members of Congress are accountable to us as citizens and voters. And so that's where you really want all of that immigration policy made. So is there a lot of movement in Congress? No. There are some people who in the last Congress and in this Congress have been working on some bills. We've seen some bipartisan efforts like the Dignity Act, which I would call not quite comprehensive, but touches a lot of different areas of immigration policy. You saw a big border and enforcement bill come through the Senate that really never had a chance, but it was bipartisan as well, led by Senator Lankford from Oklahoma. And that was mostly on enforcement. That was in the last administration. There are some bills filed right now that would nibble on the edges of legal migration and try to make some headway on bringing in more temporary workers. There was a movement for a long time on an Afghan Adjustment Act for all of those Afghan allies that were evacuated in 2021 to give them a pathway to citizenship so they wouldn't be stuck in the asylum system. As we know, most of them would qualify for asylum. That hasn't gone anywhere either. So we don't see a lot of movement in Congress, and the appetite seems to be on smaller, more discrete pieces of legislation. It's not to say they're not working on it. It's just not as big of a political moment for immigration legislatively. And as we know, Congress has had to work on a few other things lately. They're busy or not with funding the government, depending on your perspective.
Paul's happy not to be furloughed in his job these days. Well, I'm going to ask why anyway, Laura. So we've got, I think there's probably, well, I'll ask you first of all, do you feel like there's broad consensus in the country that we do need comprehensive immigration reform? And if so, why is that stymied?
I think Americans do recognize that we need to fix our immigration system, but I think there's a divide on how to do that and what needs to be done first. We've seen the public opinion polling over the course of this administration really flip from, being a little iffy on whether immigration is good for the U.S. to saying that it really is good for the United States. And I think that, when people think that the border is under control, then they have a little bit more positive view of immigration. And I think that's because there's a couple of reasons for that. One, border security matters. It's really important that we get it right. And we do want to know who's coming into our country. And we do want to make sure our border patrol has the ability to focus on true threats and not just responding to a humanitarian crisis. But also because, if there's this misconception that most immigration to the United States is illegal rather than legal. And most years, the vast majority of immigrants that come to the United States are legal. And so there is, I think, a broad consensus that we need to do something. I think there is a big divide still on what that is. And if you were to review the legislation that got close over the last several years, a lot of it, the political fights are, what are we doing on the border? What are we doing for the undocumented? But where the details get lost is, who are we bringing in legally? What categories are they in? Where are they from? And how many of them are we going to bring in? That future flows question. And you can really kind of go back and look at all of the bills, and they sort of start to fall apart on that. In 2006, 2007, I think it was a indefinitely renewable worker visa. That fell apart there. And that's a future flows issue, because we've had throughout history, and you can speak more to this, these questions of who we should be bringing in and how many. It's this, what do we want the United States to look like? Instead of saying, this is the country where everyone who we bring in here becomes an American, and we believe in freedom and opportunity, we focus a little bit too much on the who and the where.
Do you have anything to add to that, Jim?
Well, I was going to, often you hear people say they should just get in line, and wait like everyone else. But I'd love to hear Paul talk about the line. There is no line. There is no queue. I mean, if you wanted to immigrate here legally from India or Mexico, what would it be, 20, 30 years you would have to wait?
Yeah.
So where's the line, Paul?
So yeah, that's true that there's so many people that they don't have a way to legally come here. I think in a lot of ways we have a lot of good legal ways for people to come, but a lot of people can come. And there's also these nasty provisions in the law that make it impossible for people to get their green card. So you could be here as a mother of 6 kids and have no criminal history and be a really good person, but because you entered illegally, you're not going to be able to get your green. You're not going to be able to get your green card. Even if you leave, you're not going to be able to get your green card. The '96 law, the IRA passed all these nasty provisions that really made it impossible for people to get their green cards. Immigration law is very unforgiving. There's no statute of limitations. You've got a crime 30 years ago. We've got clients who they've come and gone and they have a really old conviction, but now the Trump administration is putting them in proceedings and detaining them. And some of them may end up getting their removal canceled. But then that '96 law made it, if it's a certain type of offense, you can't get it canceled, even if it's 30 years ago.
In the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act, where we really did do a very radical reform of our legal immigration policy. Basically, the law opens up one avenue for legal immigration, and that's through the family provision. So about 2/3 of the people who come into this country legally have relatives here. And, that's still the main way you get here. It's only about, I think less than 20% of the people who can come in for work authorization. And I think that would include probably people who come in on temporary visas. So we have a very small window for people to get here and work legally. And economists often point out, why do we prioritize family? Well, there's a reason we want to see families living together. But if you go back to what Laura was talking about, the last really major immigration reform in this country was in 1990, and that was a law that focused on legal immigration. It was the law that created the H-1B. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about what's going on with the H-1B visa, which is for high-skilled people. Before that, you go to the 1986 law, which was IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, and that one was focused on undocumented immigration and what to do with the undocumented. And yes, we had a pretty big amnesty then, but I just wanted to, a couple of things about Congress, and I've actually worked a lot on Congress, roll call voting on these issues, and when they were trying to bring the 1986 bill to the floor of the House of Representatives, there was a big Irish-American guy named Tip O'Neill. Some of you may remember Congressman O'Neill, and there was a meeting in his office, and he was absolutely dead set against this bill coming to the floor of the House of Representatives. And he said, he looked around the room, they were all men. He said, "Gentlemen, immigration is political death." He said, "You open up this can of worms, everybody's going to go away. They're going to be angry. But the bill did make it through the House. Who was the last really pro-immigration president, one of the most pro-immigration president of the post-World War II period? His name was Ronald Reagan. And he wanted to see the country be what he called a shining city on the hill, that it would be open. So he signed that bill into law, and it was under George H.W. Bush that the 1990 law was passed. But after that, in the 1990s, all of these coalitions that we saw in Congress, where the Democrats and the Republicans could come together and pass a law, those coalitions really fell apart. You had civil rights, liberal Democrats who could get together with Wall Street Republicans, and they could pass these laws. Well, those coalitions just simply disappeared in the 1990s, and as we move into the 2000s, 2010 period, immigration is just political death. I mean, you can't, if you move a little bit on this issue, you know, Republican moves a little bit more towards the Democrats, you're going to get hammered politically if you do that. And that has a lot to do with our political system, our electoral system, and what's happening with political parties. So those, what I call those rights markets coalitions, where you had politicians could come together and make these laws, they have really disintegrated. I'd be happy to talk more about that. And so to go back to Laura's point, if the Congress, which is supposed to have plenary power when it comes to immigration, if the Congress simply is paralyzed and cannot act on these issues, then the executive has to sort of make stuff up. That's how we got DACA, that's how we got DAPA. And of course, the courts look at this and say, well, wait a minute, you know, this is supposed to be Congress making the law, not the executive branch. And Trump, of course, has taken this to the absolute extremes. I mean, even the other day they said the president has plenary power and authority to do this. He's claimed that power, you know, with respect to tariffs. He's claimed it with respect to immigration. Eventually, this is going to end up in the Supreme Court, and I'd love to hear what some of the lawyers think about what might happen next year.
A lot of my colleagues are disappointed with the Supreme Court for doing certain things, but you have seen the courts checking the Trump administration. For example, with the Alien Enemies Act, the Trump administration purported to remove all these Venezuelans to Salvador under the Alien Enemies Act from 1798. So immigration was a big political issue at the founding. And Supreme Court sort of 9-0 said, no, at least those non-citizens have a right in federal district court to challenge whether they are alien enemies. And a Trump judge and a Trump-appointed judge from Trump 45 said that this Tren de Aragua are not agents of Maduro, and they're not invading our country. And so it's been nice to see that in our country, that sort of the courts doing some checking. In my opinion, maybe not enough, but at least some checking of the administration.
There's so much to talk about here. Well, I'm going to ask you, Laura, because I think you're in a unique position to talk about this. You've seen immigration, how it's played out in various presidential administrations, starting with the Bush administration through, but let's leave Trump aside for a second and just talk about the administrations leading up to this administration. What do you think has been done right and not right, and are there common themes that run through the various presidential administrations?
Where I think that things have gone well on immigration policy across administrations is when you have the executive branch take a leadership role in working with Congress to produce good legislation, right? I feel like a broken record. I'm sure that they get sick of hearing it from me, but when I talk to policymakers, when I talk to congressional staff, I always say, you can fix this. We heard during the Biden administration, sometimes staffers would complain about the parole programs that were allowing us to vet people from Venezuela and Nicaragua and Haiti and Cuba and let them come in on a temporary status, which the Trump administration's been canceling those statuses. And I said, if you don't like the parole programs, you can reform parole. Congress gave the executive branch this power in the past, and you don't have to like how they're using it, but you also can change the law. And they forget that sometimes because we've gotten into this habit. Congress has gotten into this habit of just being like, oh, well, the executive branch needs to fix this. Congress needs to fix it. And so when they've done a good job, It's when they've worked with Congress on good pieces of bipartisan legislation. Obviously, those have not passed in the last several years, but that's and the executive branch obviously has a really important role on enforcement, and they have a lot of things that they have to balance. They have to balance foreign policy considerations. They have to balance humanitarian considerations. They have to make sure that we are a safe, secure country. But Congress is the one that has to do the immigration laws, and so if there are policy priorities in an administration, the executive branch has to get in there and work with Congress to make those a reality.
So this is a collision of policy and just humanity. Immigration is a great example of that. And people in general are poorly informed. The public is poorly informed about immigration. What do you think that people get wrong about immigration?
I guess a better question would be, what do they get right about immigration?
Well, we'll start with that one. What do they get right? That'd be a short
Well,
answer,
I mean,
probably.
in fairness, we are a country of laws, and we have to find a way to protect the rule of law. And there is no question that having 11, 12 million people living in this country without papers, that is a very bad thing. So somebody somewhere along the line really screwed up. And the question is, how do you fix this? And how do you fix it in such a way that you do not destroy the very legal fabric of our society? You've got to protect due process. But to go back to your question, that's... And I think most people, Laura alluded to this, if they can see that immigration is legal, orderly, and that we've got a real process and that it's working, you don't have people flooding into the country, the majority of Americans are sympathetic and favorable to immigration. Where there's a tremendous amount of misconception and misunderstanding, this is something I've worked on, written about, for decades now. Americans don't necessarily understand the economics of immigration very well. There is a misconception that an immigrant in means a job loss for Americans, and that's simply not true, because immigrants are complements in the labor market. They fill gaps in the labor market. They take jobs that Americans either can't take or won't take. So the idea that immigrants are stealing jobs of Americans from an economic standpoint, that's just not true. And immigrants fill big gaps in our labor market. At the low end of the labor market, I don't know how many of you in here have jobs making beds and cleaning hotel rooms or working in rest homes. We just don't have people at that end of the labor market. And of course, we have at the high end of the labor market, we're very, very reliant on bringing in a lot of very highly skilled people. 70% of the patents, innovation in Silicon Valley, these are immigrants who are doing that innovation, creating things. So, and immigrants are not coming to the United States to get on welfare. That's another misconception. You can look at the National Academy of Sciences has done studies on this, and the use of public services, it's almost identical to what we see with the native-born people. So no, immigrants are not coming in to steal jobs. The idea that every immigrant or refugee or asylum seeker is a danger, that they are going to commit a crime, murder somebody. I would encourage you to go get on the Cato Institute website. They actually have calculated the probabilities that you will be victim of a crime by a refugee or an immigrant. For immigrants, I think it's 1 in 2 billion or something like that. So you're much more likely to be struck by lightning or killed crossing the street than you are to be the victim of a crime. But and the same is true with refugees and asylum seekers. But the bill there is immigration, politics, and policy has a huge symbolic element to it. So all it takes is one crime, and you're off to the races then. So Immigration, again, you can go home and read about symbolic politics. We've been studying this for decades in the political science field. And some areas of policy they're symbols. The symbols sort of dominate things. Does that mean that there are no dangers, no threats? Of course not. I mean, all of you in this room, or many of you, hopefully, are old enough to remember the 9/11 terrorist attacks. That illustrated the dangers. And former President Bush was in office when this happened, and the number one responsibility of the government is to protect us from things like that. And yes, those 19 guys came in legally. They came in on visas. We hosted at SMU in a few years after the 9/11 attacks. We had the former Consul General of the United States in Hamburg, Germany, who came through, and he had finished his career. It was his office, that let many of the 9/11 hijackers into the country. Would you want to be the Consul General that was responsible for letting those guys in? So yes, there are dangers. But if you look at refugees in particular, Paul, is there any other group of immigrants in our society that are more vetted and controlled than refugees?
So vetted, yes, that's so true. It's funny about INS. So INS went away with the Homeland Security Act, and the thing that really put the nail in the coffin was 6 months to the day after 9/11, one of the INS service centers spewed out visa renewals for some of the terrorists, because no one had thought to, because the terrorists were complying with their immigration status. Before their F visa was going to expire, they filed for an extension of it, and so no one thought to go into the systems and sort of pull those out. And so that was a horrible symbolic, hearing about that, and led to the end of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. I mean, I think what you said is, the legal immigration, you can do it in ways that facilitate people coming here legally, that they can come with their families. You're going to be strengthening society. If you do it in a way that's really unrestricted, it can be really bad. One of my colleagues in New York, she's an ICE attorney there, and she lives on the Upper West Side. I think she's independently wealthy, and her liberal girlfriends would give her a hard time. How can you work for ICE? You're deporting all these people, and then, when all the Venezuelans came to New York and were living in hotels, she said her girlfriends sounded like Donald Trump. That they were very unhappy with all the kind of craziness and partying and all the problems that arose with that. And again, that sort of letting in so many people as the Biden administration did, I don't think intentionally, but and it's not all their fault. You had COVID coming to an end, and you had this incredible demand for labor. It led to the current policies we have.
I just want to give you one quick statistic. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, if you look at the number of people of concern to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, these include asylum seekers, refugees, internally displaced people. 86% of those people are in the South, the developing world. So the vast majority of people who are of concern, who've been displaced, who are seeking refuge, they are not in the wealthy countries of the North. So we need to take 3 deep breaths. Yes, we had a little bit of a crisis with the asylum but in terms of the numbers, that's basically a drop in the bucket. And in Europe now, the shoe's on the other foot, because many of the Ukrainians, of course, have been displaced, and they've had to flee to Europe. And the Europeans have done the right thing, opened their economy, their society to these people who are fleeing the conflict in Ukraine. So the Europeans are much closer to a lot of these problems than we are in this country. I always say we're lucky to live in such a peaceful hemisphere where we don't have the kinds of problems that you see all over the world. They're much bigger problems in terms of humanitarian disasters, humanitarian crises. So just think about, all the problems we have. We're pretty darn lucky here, if you think about it.
We have a very open economy, so immigrants can come and work and succeed. All these great stories of the Vietnamese, coming to the United States and starting over, and these very high-level professionals, opening donut shops, and their kids are super successful and talented. And because of our open labor market, that facilitates that. Whereas I think in Europe, you often have more socialized welfare states, and so when the Turks or the Syrians come to Germany, they're sort of put apart into a community, and they can't really integrate and economically and succeed like they can in our country.
Yeah, I've actually written quite a bit about this, and it is true. The U.S., we are incredibly good at integrating people quickly into our society, including refugees and asylum seekers. Got a great friend and colleague, Professor Philip Martin at the University of California, Davis, who, like me, has done a lot of work in Germany. And he would always say the greatest fear in Germany is you let a refugee, asylum seeker in, and they get a job. You've got to keep them sort of out of the labor market. And the great fear in the United States is we have refugees and asylum seekers who come here, and they don't get a job. We want them quickly to get into the labor market. So we do this much better. The U.S. is a champion in terms of assimilating and integrating people.
All right, we have 5 minutes, so I'm gonna ask a really easy question for us to round up on. What would a just and fair immigration system look like? But really, it forces you to give something very succinct. So what would that be for each of you?
It would respect due process and the rule of law, and it would be efficient.
Very succinct, thank you.
It has to be a system that allows for legal and orderly migration. So you don't want the chaos that you see often at the border, but this would mean having, I don't know if there are any Canadians in the audience. The Canadians hate to hear this, but they have a pretty good system with their point system, where you award points if you have family members. If you're seeking asylum or if you're a refugee, you get points for that. And if the Canadians give lots of points if you are able to come and work and you fill gaps in the Canadian labor market. So we should look at the Canadian point system and think about how we might be able to adapt that here.
I would say a lot more legal immigration, facilitating families coming as well, and also a credible border that respects due process, as opposed to some of the things that in the Biden administration and the Trump administration have been doing, which really take away due process.
This is the last question before we get your questions, so be thinking about it. What gives you hope that we can achieve this system that y'all just described, if anything?
Well, the Soviet Union collapsed. If that can happen, then maybe that we can have a just immigration system. Things may seem very dark now, but often in history you look back and you see that this led to something much better. So I'm optimistic. For immigration lawyers out there, and for our clients even more, it's a very dark, scary, painful time. But I hope that we can lead to sort of a just immigration system, and we don't have in 3 years something that's like even farther to the left, and the pendulum swings even further to the left. I hope we avoid that.
Yeah, I would go back to the history. I mean, look, we've gone through this many times before in our history, and we've somehow, Americans are pretty clever people, very ingenious people. So I think if something's not working, we can find ways to fix it. I always like to remind, especially a Texas audience, of some of the ferocious debates that were happening in Texas in the 1920s. There was a governor named Ma Ferguson who they were having a debate over whether English should be the official language of the state of Texas. And she said, if English was good enough for our Lord Jesus Christ, it's good enough for the people of the great state of Texas. So these kind of things give me heart that we can rise above some of the divisions that we see in our country.
Gracias, Ma.
I think that we still have this very romantic notion about immigration in this country, right? A lot of us know the origin story of our own families that came here, and the details aren't always pretty or perfect, but we do have this romantic notion that our ancestors came here and they became Americans, and they're good American citizens, and so we're good American citizens. And you saw that sort of idealistic idea really start to come together again when we evacuated all those Afghans in 2021. And the number of regular people who raised their hands and said, I want to help the refugee orgs that are doing the resettlement. I want to welcome these people. I want to pick them up from the airport. I want to make sure that they have their needs met. That is the sort of thing that gives me hope on this, because we are still a very welcoming country. And it's all of us here. Our government's not always going to have welcoming policies, but the American people are still very welcoming.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really perfect way to round up our conversation. And thank you to each of you for just bringing light to this topic that, like you said, this seems like a dark time. Well, it doesn't seem like a dark time. It is a dark time right now. So thank you for reflecting light, not heat. Appreciate that. So we're going to, let's have a round of applause for the panel. So we're going to take your questions now, and I'm going to be reading these off of this iPad here. And I think you're going to be passing cards to, I can't see out there, so I think people are walking around for you to pass the cards to. And we'll start with this question. Yeah, this is I don't. How we process, you mentioned this, Paul, the processing and vetting of refugees. How have the efforts to vet refugees in other countries worked for the United States?
I'm no expert on refugees, but it is an extremely serious vetting process where they're vetted, by the officers, the State Department officers, or the USCIS officers working with them based on their countries and the countries they came from. So it's a very serious vetting process. Of course, it's not perfect. And people will have perfect records and come in and still commit crimes, but it's a very good process.
Yeah, sometimes people have waited years and years in refugee camps for the chance to be resettled somewhere. And the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, which works to apply the Refugee Convention, will very carefully select people who they think qualify for resettlement. Then we have the vetting process that's done by our own government before people are ever resettled here. So it is one of the most rigorous processes. So don't be afraid of refugees.
It's like 14 steps. I think it's 14, yeah.
How would you reassure, this is a question about without giving legal advice, how would you address the concerns of asylum seekers? But I'd say more broadly, there is a lot of anxiety in immigrant communities here, including people with pending asylum cases. What would your input be for people who are feeling anxious right now?
Get a good lawyer. So much. I was at the Texas UT CLE conference. I spoke there last week, and so much of it can be just throw some monkey wrenches in the process, buy time, hope maybe you wait for a new administration. Unfortunately, detention is very powerful, and if a non-citizen is detained, they'll still get their asylum claim, but it goes really quickly. One of my colleagues checked in with a client at ICE, like a 21-year-old woman, and she had a pending asylum claim, and she was detained, and the ICE officer was like, "Well, at least she'll have her hearing more quickly." Like, thanks, not too helpful. So there's not a lot of hope, I think, in the asylum world right now. I mean, certain countries, they may have better claims for asylum. There's so many Venezuelans here. If Maduro goes away, which would be a good thing, but it would certainly negatively impact a lot of the asylum claims because that would maybe take away a lot of the basis for the claims.
So we've talked a lot about perceptions of the public and misperceptions, myths, that sort of thing. A lot of that is not the responsibility of government, it's responsibility for all of us. So some of you might be having Thanksgiving with your crazy uncle. What would be a good way to talk about immigration if you happen to find yourself around the table with, I am a crazy uncle, so
I'll
no offense.
take that one. I recognize most people do not touch or encounter the immigration system in the way that I do on a regular basis. They really don't know any of the rules. They don't know how any of it works. I often hear from people, I don't understand why the people at the border didn't just apply for a work permit. When you start to walk them through what that looks like, then they understand. And so I think the curiosity matters here, and asking, well, why do you think that is a helpful thing to ask. I also think reminding anyone that you're talking to, it's a human being, right? So often in immigration policy, especially on the economic side, we talk about the aggregate numbers. These are all individual human beings. They do have rights in this country, whether you agree with the number of rights they have or not, they still exist. And, it's still acceptable. I like having these conversations, but it is still acceptable to say, what an odd thing to say at Thanksgiving dinner, and then, move on to football.
Yeah, well, you have to bring it down to the human level, I think. And people, we know from a lot of research that those who live with immigrants, have a lot of contact with immigrants, tend to be very favorable towards the immigrants. If you look at people who vote for anti-immigration policies and politicians, they are people who are far away from the immigrants. They're people out often in the countryside. But the other thing I would say, which we've seen a little bit of this here tonight, if you got that crazy uncle, tell him the story about Ma Ferguson. Get a little humor going in there. Get people to relax about this and get them to think about their own immigrant heritage. Almost all my ancestors, I'm a complete dinosaur, because my family are almost 90% Anglos. They were all here in the 1600s. I'll say about my family, you're in trouble when the only diversity you have in your family are the Scots.
Those are great comments. I have nothing to add.
I hope you have some Scottish ancestors.
There's been a lot of conversation about self-deportation. Can you talk about that?
Well, because of the fear of the Trump administration, there have been a lot of people that have just simply left the country. There's also this, it used to be called the CBP-1 app, which was a way that non-citizens could show up in Ciudad Juarez and be allowed into the country for an asylum hearing. And that app was renamed the CBP Home app, and so you can use that to get $1,000 if you're willing to leave the country.
Yeah, but my question for this, and obviously I don't want you to give people legal advice, is what legal rights might you give up if you leave the country voluntarily using CBP Home?
Oh, yeah, Kristi Noem says, yeah, you just leave and we'll help you come back legally, but because of some of the laws in IRA in 1996, if people leave, they may never be able to come back.
Well, especially with the crackdown on immigration and the H-1B and the high-skilled, the Canadians, the Australians, and the Brits and others are celebrating because they're going to be the beneficiary of our crackdown on immigration. So these people will go to other places, other countries. They will probably make a great contribution there, and this is going to be a real detriment for our own society and economy.
Now it's with H-1Bs, you need to pay $100,000 to bring in the person on the H-1B. You can call it the H-100,000B.
Dr. Hollifield, you mentioned the Dallas Fed in the study. How would they access that?
You just go on the Dallas website and Dallas Fed website, and you look up immigration and the local economy, and it will come up. There's a study A very careful scientific study that was done with surveys of employers all around Dallas-Fort Worth to see how they are coping with the immigration crackdown. I think it may even be called immigration crackdown in the economy or something like that. Look up one of the principal authors, Dr. Pia Arrhenius, who's one of the great immigration scholars right here in Dallas-Fort Worth at the Fed. You can look her up, look on the website, and you'll find these studies, and they're easy to read, easily and accessible. You can bring those to your crazy uncle at Thanksgiving.
Thank you on behalf of crazy uncles everywhere. So a number of you mentioned DACA when we were talking about executive department acting where Congress would not. But let's talk about the plight and circumstance of DACA. And do you think that DACA has been a positive good for our country?
Okay, I'll start. So we can see in the data that DACA, if you were a dreamer who was eligible for DACA, that there was a positive impact on your life. You were able to have valid work authorization. You're able to get a job that actually meets your skills and abilities. A lot of these are people who have college degrees. When Congress first started really talking about a DREAM Act, which DACA was the result of not being able to pass one, that was in like 2000, 2001. I was 18. People who would have qualified for that are my age. So right now they're in their early 40s. They have American citizen children. Some of them are married to U.S. citizens but don't qualify for green cards because they might have entered without inspection, as you mentioned before. There has been a positive impact on their lives and on their families' lives. That said, DACA as an executive action can go away. It's still under court challenge. Legislation and a permanent solution for them is the better option. Right now, there isn't a lot of political appetite for that. Congress is still kind of letting it play out in the courts and see what happens. In the meantime, people who might have qualified for DACA because of the court challenge weren't able to apply. So you have this sort of static, frozen in place group of people that we can look at and study because they've had this work authorization now for over 10 years, and we can see the positive impact it's had not only on their lives but on our economy.
Just remember what it stands for, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So you're talking about people who came here as children, minors. They were brought here by their parents. So I think most Americans would say, you can't hold the child responsible for, an action that was taken by the parents, even though they are in the country illegally. Just one quick anecdote. I have a colleague who shall remain nameless who grew up in L.A., family from Hong Kong. He turned 16 years old. He asked for a birth certificate to go get his driver's license, and his parents said, "Oh, oops, we forgot to tell you, we've been in this country. You've been in this country illegally." So he thought his life was over and it was at an end. But fortunately, the state of California said people like him could go to university, in-state tuition, and he qualified for DACA. He eventually met and married his college sweetheart and was able to get an adjustment of status. So there are ways to survive this, but think of him. Was that his fault, his responsibility? Should he be held responsible and sent back to Hong Kong, a place he had never been before in his life? I don't think he even spoke Cantonese. So, think of this is justice we're talking about here. So, we're a just people, the Americans. So, I think most Americans would say that's just. This is a policy that's just.
I would just say one of the unjust things of this current administration is that some of the DACA kids were in immigration court, and then those cases were sort of parked or closed, and the administration is trying to recalendar those cases and put them back into removal proceedings, which is incredibly anxiety-producing and worrisome.
I'm very, very thankful for the DACA and for the way that's benefited all the people in my life that have contributed so much to our community. I can't imagine not having that. Let's talk about rhetoric. I think that's one of the things, rhetoric and propaganda. What are the impacts on our community of the worst examples of propaganda and negative things that are dehumanizing things that are said about immigrants.
Well, just look at the DHS and ICE Twitter feeds and the some of the memes they're having. I think they had a meme. I don't play Halo, but I think it was like an image of the aliens as being like the people you need to kill in Halo, and join ICE and do that. You see that sort of rhetoric.
Yeah, there's always been a struggle over the narrative, and it goes both ways. I mean, you can have, these very negative images of the newcomers, the immigrants. We've seen this again throughout American history. But what gives me some hope is that, there's an equally powerful narrative that goes in the other direction. That these are now our neighbors. They're our the children are going to school with my children, and you again see them as human beings, and that's what can influence the narrative, I think. And there are lots of positive things that we look back in American history, so we should try to stress those positive things, which allow us to deal with these difficult issues that are before us.
I think we all would want our political leaders to use civil language, even when we're talking about difficult topics. But so much of that starts with us, and we don't have to model the language that other people use. We are responsible for our own actions, and we're our own leaders in our own community, whether it's in your neighborhood, in your faith community, in your community organizations. And you have the power to be the model civil behavior and model positive rhetoric, even when you have a policy choice that may not be the same as your neighbors, right? We can still disagree in a way that is respectful of each other and of the people we are discussing, whose lives are impacted by the policies.
Yeah, I could just throw in one other quick anecdote here. I spent part of my career at a little college up in Boston, Massachusetts, called Harvard, and
I've heard of it.
One of my great colleagues, great political scientist, Samuel Huntington, who wrote many great books, but one of his last books was called "Who Are We?" and very, very negative about immigration, especially Mexicans. He said they're never going to make it. They just can't succeed in this society. And I was talking about this book with a great friend and colleague here in Dallas, a leader in the Jewish community, and I won't mention his name, but he looked at me and he said, "But wait a minute, that's what they said about the Jews in the 1920s and 30s. And I said, "Yes, we've heard this before." So you need to get that kind of historical perspective just to understand that we've been through these things before as a society, and we have managed to cope, maybe bad times, but we do tend to get through this. And the Jews became good, solid Americans, and Mexicans, Central Americans are on a similar path.
Thank you. We have 2 minutes and before we end, so let's just end on I'd almost like to end on that. That was a really great parting thought, Jim. But each of you take just a few seconds to summarize something you'd like to leave the audience with about immigration.
We need immigration reform in this country, and we need it to be done sooner rather than later. All of us have the ability to impact this conversation. Our elected representatives, the ones who are writing the laws, they listen when you call. And so whether you want to call them about immigration policy or about something else, that's up to you. But they are responsive to the feedback that they get from constituents. And so please don't be shy about being that informed and engaged citizen and doing your part to contribute to the conversation.
We have a very strong civil society in this country, and that's what makes me also optimistic. So, go out in your churches, your synagogues, and mosques, go to the schools, talk to your fellow citizens, and see if you can get a conversation going. And I agree with Laura that it's very important to make your views known to our elected representatives. and see if you can influence the debate, from the ground up, from the grassroots level.
Those are great thoughts. The only, I guess, small thing I would add is pointing out these many injustices of the Trump administration and not distinguishing people that should be in removal proceedings from people that shouldn't, and advocating with your representatives that reign of terror stop, that the government exercises discretion like it used to do and focuses on removing people that are threats to our country.
Thank you so much. Let's hear a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you for coming out this evening to hear and to contribute and to engage our minds. I'm going to leave us with this, my favorite quote from Seamus Heaney, the Nobel Prize winning poet. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave, but then once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. Thank you.
Thank you.